A year ago, Dan Clark released his flagship closed-back headphones, the Stealth, with the quite revolutionary AMTS technology. Well, now to go along with them is the Expanse, using the same technology but in an open-backed headphone. Let's check them out. If you think about the majority of headphone owners these days, they will own something maybe, if it's more sophisticated than something cheap, from say Apple, Bose or Sony that does very sophisticated noise cancelling and has many other useful features. For example, Apple has their ability to have a transparency mode where you can even hear with the direction that audio is coming from. It's like not having headphones on at all or not having earphones in at all. Pretty remarkable, actually, if you think about it. Sony has features such as if you have noise cancelling headphones on, it will allow voice through if someone's trying to speak to you so that you don't miss what they're saying. So features such as that are the norm, where technology is used to adapt the headphones to your environment and so even to your ears, because the latest AirPod Max will actually adapt to the shape of your ears to give you a consistent sound from your music. However, those headphones will have one problem with it. All the processing, you lose some of the fine detail that is in the best recordings. That gives you the real experience. You know, if you feel like almost like you're there, especially with very good binaural recordings. Now, in terms of technology in headphones such as the Dan Clark Audio Expanse, they focus on giving you the most accurate reproduction of sound from your audio equipment through to your ear. And the most critical area for that is this space between the drivers and your ear. And for that, they use revolutionary technology called AMTS. And it's not dissimilar to technology you see in places such as concert halls and high-end studios and even really high-end speaker rooms. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the features of the Dan Clark Audio Expanse headphones, from the fit and comfort through to the fact that they fold. And then I'm going to talk about the AMTS technology that's in them. If you've already seen one of my previous videos, such as on the Stealth, you'll have already seen this and you can jump to the next chapter. And then, of course, I'm going to talk about my impressions listening to music, listening through different types of audio gear, such as the gear I have behind me, and also how they compare to other headphones, including, for example, the previous Stealth headphones, which are the flagship closeback. So next up, let's talk about the design. Over the years, we've seen Dan Clark come up with some pretty novel ideas in terms of how to design headphones. For example, when designing a pair of headphones, a manufacturer has to consider the headband. This has to be able to stretch enough to fit and hold the headphones comfortably on the ears of people with all sorts of head sizes and shapes. And it was pretty amazing that one of Dan's employees came up with the idea of using nitinol wire, which is this stuff. Now, you may be familiar with it in terms of the wire that's used in braces. And basically, it's an alloy that will keep its shape no matter how deformed. So even if I do crazy stuff with the headphones like this, it will not damage them. And that also not only makes them very flexible and adjustable, but it also makes them very robust, as you don't have a complex mechanism that can bend out of shape. And I've seen manufacturers absolutely amazed at this idea, but he's upgraded it even further this time, because previously, whereas you had the headband adjustment using sliders, he is using high quality elastic, and that means you just have to put them straight on and they fit immediately. Now, Dan recommends that you have them forward and down when you put them on. Now, one thing you'll be happy to know is that unlike the Stealth, which had the issue whereby you could, if you broke the seal, you'd lose bass, because these are open-backed headphones rather than closed-backed, you don't have that issue any longer. However, in terms of the cups, you can probably see that the cups are a little bit thinner with the Expanse, and they also have this cool, well, first thing I thought was basket weave, but actually it's kind of like looking at the as like an Android version of the cross-section of some bone, and it kind of follows on with the kind of organic aesthetic that the headphones do have. So for example, this mechanism for the folding system, if you look up close, its shape is more like something much more organic than, just using straightforward, kind of edgy metal pieces. And Dan actually told me he went to a lot of trouble to get the shape and design of that just right. But it looks thin, and it looks simple, and it allows the headphones, as you saw, to fold down. And even though these are open back headphones and they're not something you might take out and about like you could possibly do with the Stealth, it does allow them to be transported very easily without being bulky. And it also means they're very lightweight, so they do sit comfortably and can sit comfortably in your ears for a long time. And they have very thick, plush ear pads. And the ear pads themselves are taped on, but they can be taken off and put back on, although eventually they'll lose stickiness and start to come loose. But the headphones themselves are very readily repairable, with things like the headband just held on by a single screw on each side, and the whole headphones can be maintained as required with head pad changes, ear pad changes as necessary. Likewise, the cable is pretty much the same kind of cable as Dan Clark has offered for some years. It uses very robust Hirose connectors. Now, Hirose connectors are medical equipment grade connectors, and they're designed to be used on equipment where they're connected and disconnected maybe even dozens of times per day and thousands of times over their lifetime. So they are easy to attach and remove, and easy, and will stay functional for many years without issue. So the whole design is designed to be long-lasting, repairable, and if necessary, upgradable. The most important piece of technology in these headphones we've taken a look at already with the Stealth. It's the AMTS system. Now, if you're looking in this video, you can probably see, and I'll check on my monitors so you get the right angle here. If I hold it up in front of the light, you can probably just see these holes in the middle there. There is a 3D printed piece of material in there which has these hexagonal holes passing through to the driver, although some of them are blocked. And why is that? Well, the purpose of the AMTS system goes back to issues we have with sound in general. Now, that is, most of the sound we actually hear is reflected. Actually, if you are listening in any room to any sound, you will hear mostly reflected sound from around you, some direct, but a lot reflected. Now, if this is most noticeable if you go into, say, a studio with even just something as simple as perforated board walls, or very noticeable in an anechoic chamber, which is designed to have no reflections whatsoever. If you go in with someone else, you can talk to them directly, but if you start moving your head away, the sound just almost drops off completely. And it's very unnerving not having reflected sound so much that we are used to it. Now, in audio settings, reflected sound is a big issue. Now, if you've gone and seen a band in a small venue which doesn't have any sound treatment, it's very loud, it's very congested, and not particularly ideal. Yet if you go to somewhere like a very sophisticated concert hall, you'll see all sorts of material and shapes and design aspects that are designed to optimize the movement of sound inside the hall so that you hear just the right amount of all the frequencies directed at you, whether you're sitting all the way up the back or in the middle or down the front, and not too many reflections such that it is distracting from the music itself. Now, a lot of different materials and shapes and designs are used in this way. Likewise, high-end music listening rooms, you'll see things like bass traps that have very wide open gaps which are designed to absorb low frequencies, or up to material pads which are designed to absorb higher frequencies. Now, since every frequency has its own frequency length, we know that you can create things called Helmholtz resonators. And this is basically, if you have a chamber that matches that frequency, you can use that chamber to absorb those frequencies if for some reason they are not desired. Likewise, there's the kind of opposite, that trick where someone takes a wine glass and aims a very high frequency at it and causes it to shatter. Every material has its own resonance. So if you think like in a pair of headphones, you have the ear pads have some resonance, the cups will have their own resonant frequency. And if you hear, and I'll put them in front of the microphone, even the nitinol wire will have its own frequency, although I just can tell you now, it doesn't interfere with the music unless you're going to sit there tapping it while you're listening. Those resonant frequencies can cause issues in headphones, and a famous one is the Grado headphones and their regular ear pads. Now, the ear pads have a particular size that causes them to resonate slightly at around 2 kilohertz. And one of the cool tricks that people worked out is if you tape the pads to reduce them resonating, that will reduce the kind of exciting sound that you get around the 2 kilohertz mark, which actually kind of you consider one of the features of the headphones. So a lot of these headphones actually do resonate in ways that in some respects you can consider sounding exciting, but in other aspects you can consider a kind of distortion. One of the aims of the AMTS system is to reduce those kinds of distortions from the materials and from other aspects of how the sound moves inside the cups. And the way it does that, again, is if you look at the AMTS material, you'll see that it has a range of size of holes, and these can be blocked off as required to reduce any frequencies which are resonating inside the headphones. This in turn reduces distortion, much like you might use similar materials inside a room to reduce reflections, and it improves the sound quality noticeably. This is alongside technology used in other parts of the headphones, such as the driver, which consists of a single-sided planar magnetic driver or orthodynamic driver. Now they use single-sided magnets on the drivers here with the AMTS on the other side, and maybe one of the downsides of this whole setup is that the sensitivity and impedance are both low. So that means you do require, the low impedance means that you do require more current to get the diaphragms moving, but to get enough sound, because they are relatively insensitive, you do require yet again much more power to get sufficient loudness. And that does limit them somewhat in that you won't really be plugging them into, say, a portable player and getting, loud, clear sound out of them. You do really need kind of desktop gear like I have behind me to get the best results. Though I did use them successfully with, say, IFI's iDSD Diablo or Chord's Hugo 2, and also things like FIO's M17, especially in desktop mode, those drove them quite well. They are really desktop class headphones. So with all this fancy technology in there, how do they actually perform? Well, I spent a lot of time listening with these and compared them, of course, to the Stealth and other high-end headphones with a lot of the gear behind me. And so after the break, I'm going to tell you all about that. When talking about the listening experience with a pair of headphones, it's always difficult because you're trying to describe something that maybe if you compare to other headphones that other people have heard, they have a basis on which to get an understanding of your impressions. So today I'm going to do something a little bit different and talk about from the perspective of speakers. Now, in terms of speakers in general, most are designed to be kind of measure flat. And we're assuming in here, say, an anechoic chamber, but maybe in a room there'll be a little bit of maybe bass coming from reflections off different through the walls and other objects and things. And of course, in a room you damp things as necessary, like I have in my room with bookshelves, to kind of stop that bass boominess. Now, the thing is, when you try and get speaker flat into a pair of headphones, things become a little bit different. Now, in some research that was done about a decade ago by Sean Olive, and he created what's called the Harman curve. And that was the idea of that was to try and map the equivalent of what I'm going to very loosely term speaker flat into, or a pair of high-end speakers in a fairly well-damped listening room, into a pair of headphones. Now, some people kind of get a little bit obsessed about this and consider that any headphones not tuned to the Harman curve are no good, or some crazy stuff like that. It's not like that. It's a piece of research which is very interesting, because we have a rough idea now what a pair of headphones that sound like a pair of high-end speakers would measure like in terms of frequency response. And I should note that I'm not going into a lot of useful detail and important detail, such as which measuring coupler is used to get this curve and other things, which a lot of people are going to skip altogether. But anyway, one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons I'm talking about that, is that the Stealth headphones were more or less tuned to that curve. That meant that when you put a kind of speaker equivalent, what I call very loosely again, a speaker flat measurement into a pair of headphones, the result sometimes feels like there's not quite enough bass. And I think, and I suppose that's probably because when you have bass coming from speakers, you feel it more, but when you have it coming from headphones, you don't feel it as much. So what we generally, and I call this extremely loosely because I'm vastly oversimplifying things, what we call headphone flat, which you might get as, say, a pair of Meze Elites behind me, while on the graph you see like the bass through to the mid-range might measure flat, like as in the headphone measurements of them. Actually, if you put that into the equivalent of a speaker measurement, you end up with more mid-bass. So actually the Elites behind me do sound kind of very mid-bassy. They are kind of, well, they're entertaining. They're a fun pair of headphones while being very detailed. They're one of my favorite pairs. But ignoring other parts of the kind of measurement for the moment, consider that what we call headphone flat might, in compared to a pair of speakers, be a little bit more kind of mid-bass strong. And there's some other stuff in there, but I won't go into it too much. And the reason I'm talking about the mid-bass specifically is because with the Stealth, some people found that they maybe didn't have quite enough mid-bass to be ideal for their listening experience. Now, if you're one of those people, you'll probably be happy to know that the Expanse has more mid-bass. Actually, I was quite surprised about how much it had when I first listened with them. Maybe because I got kind of used to listening with the Stealth, so it might not be as much as some headphones, but there are some other aspects to this which I'm going to get into, which affect, it's not just about how much mid-bass there is or how they measure. It wasn't quite as much as a pair of Elites. I mean, I probably found the Elites a little bit more warm still, but still there was a fair amount of it. Where this affects things is, say, the timbre. Now, the timbre on the Stealths were excellent. And so in the terms of the Expanse, it makes everything sound a little bit kind of warmer and thicker. And a funny thing that happened, I felt that I wondered if Dan had also pulled back the upper mids a little bit. But when I talked to him, he said, no, that's just the effect of having more mid-bass. And actually the mid-range and treble are the same as the Stealth. Now that mid-range is quite forward. So that brings you vocals, instruments, anything kind of that you want in your face is in your face. And that can make it quite exciting sounding. The treble, if you compare to, say, a bright pair of headphones like Hi-Fi Man's Arias, it'll sound kind of duller and a little bit more rolled off. But you could say in comparison, Arias can sound kind of bright and exciting at first listen, but can be a little bit more fatiguing depending on the gear you use. I'd say that the Stealth and Expanse have it about right in that it's neither too bright or too dull. It feels kind of more natural, like you would hear listening to actual instruments or actual vocals. Now, the next aspect of this is the soundstage. And this is where, this is why they're called the Expanse. With the Stealth, despite being a pair of closed back headphones, they sounded quite open. And the thing about that was that they didn't sound super open all the time. For example, some sounds with the Stealth sounded still a little bit close to my ears when I felt they should be further away. So they didn't always quite work. None of that problem with the Expanse, which has, cliche time, an expansive soundstage. Now, it's not HD800, HD820, crazy, big, wide, makes everything sound distant soundstage. It sounds neither too open nor too closed. So if you take that forward mid-range intimacy, yet everything seems to have its space and very evenly around one's head. Now compare that, say, to a pair of LCD5s, which is too mid-forward. Everything's in a ball around your head. The Expanse is more kind of diffuse in a bigger area around your head. Now, if I focus on the soundstage, it sounds like I'm listening to headphones. But if I don't focus on that, just enjoy the music, it sounds like about right. You don't think about it. It's about that kind of evenness that you don't think, oh, this is too much of one thing or too much of another, or the balance or the shape is wrong. It just feels about right. Now, compared to, say, the Final D8000 Pros, which are behind me there, they have a kind of more left-right soundstage, and they have the 4 kilohertz range, I think, was pulled back a bit, and it tends to make sounds like vocals and instruments sound less intimate, but kind of sometimes they're a bit pulled back when sometimes you don't want that. So they don't have quite that intimacy. And they don't have the kind of, because of that kind of slightly left-right soundstage, they don't quite sound, perfectly balanced. Probably the closest I found to the Expanse in terms of, tonality and soundstage were Hi-Fi Man Susvaras. I should note at this point, this is all listening out of high-end gear, such as the R27HE with the Susvaras, since it has a lot of power. The Susvaras sound even more expansive, not by a huge amount, but by a noticeable amount. And I think they do that maybe slightly better. But in the next area I'm going to talk about, and that's when it comes to detail and dynamics. Now, when I talk about dynamics, I should clarify that. When you have a note, the impact of that note, how much you get the sharpness of a drum hit, or, just even vocals, how clearly they come through. And, whether it doesn't matter if it's bass, mids, or treble, it's an aspect of clarity that the individual notes don't sound muffled. And this is one thing the Expanse does exceptionally well, possibly because the drivers are no longer in a closed cup inside a pair of headphones. It may have freed them up in some way to give greater dynamics. Now, I think the Stealth had this pretty well, but it comes through even more with the Expanse. I'm actually thinking this is the kind of experience I had, well, reminds me of listening, say, to the RAL Requisite headphones, where they were just super dynamic, super sharp in everything you heard. Really made listening exciting. But the thing that's great about these is not just the dynamics, the macro dynamics, but the micro detail is absolutely insane. Now, I don't know if you remember my Stax review when I did the SR009 and T8000. It was SR009S, I should say. When I had the Utopias, and I was looking at the Stax, and I thought, gee, I wish I could keep the Stax, but I can't spend that much money. That kind of experience, when you have, say, electrostats, and you have absolutely heaps of micro detail, but the thing is electrostats don't always do greatly, well, at least don't do until you spend huge amounts of money on the amplifier, is give you that kind of dynamic impact of each note. And then, of course, there are questions about the tonality. None of that problem here. Now, I want to give you an idea of how much detail increase I've had. Now, I know that horrible audio cliche where you talk about, I heard things in the music I'd never heard before. I'm going to have to use that one again because this is where we're going here. Now, you see those D8000 Pros behind me? Well, they I consider one of the most detailed headphones. They have great bass. I use them as a reference for testing gear, and so on and so on. When I started comparing the Expanse to the D8000 Pros, the same music out of the D8000 Pros, everything sounded more kind of one note. And I mean that like when you hear a note, you should hear the note and the decay and all that. And I already considered these very, very detailed headphones, but a whole lot of detail I'd been hearing with the Expanse I wasn't hearing with the D8000 Pro. And it was a shock. And it's still a shock because when I was listening with these, I thought these sound fantastic. And, I'm thinking, it's just new toy syndrome kind of factor. But it was when I started comparing headphones, I was going, oh, this is for real. This is really going in that direction where I'm pulling sounds out of music I had not heard before. There was a track where, there's like a bell rings and you can hear the note decay, but it went on for much, much longer with the Expanse than it did with other headphones I have here. And it was kind of a shock. Now, when we come back to the Susvaras, which are also extremely detailed, this is one area where the Susvaras can do very well on a nicely set up high-end system. However, I found the Susvaras, while they do sound very exciting, the kind of exciting that made me go, when I first heard them out of Hi-Fi Man's amp at a show, I was like, I want a pair of these. That kind of exciting is where the Expanse also does exceptionally well. But because Dan has focused on keeping the distortion low and eliminating things like ringing and other resonances using the AMTS system, you get this incredible clarity without that maybe slightly less exciting sound than Susvaras have. And some measurements and tests I've seen online suggest the Susvaras maybe do have a tiny bit of kind of ringing or resonance inside them. And, you get that in headphones and it makes them sound exciting. And eliminating it, you get incredible low harmonic distortion and incredible detail. And this is something where in the audio world you do get a noticeable improvement when you knock out harmonic distortion, much more so than you do in electronics. And you can hear ridiculous amounts of detail through these. And it's still, every time I listen with them, is a really exciting experience, especially if I use the gear on this side behind me. Talking about gear in general, well, driving them, they're still as insensitive and difficult to drive as the Stealth are. So you're not going to be plugging them into, say, a sub $1,000 DAP and getting, exciting listening out of it. You're going to hit the maximum volume and it's going to sound shouty and not so good. Where you can do well with these is in the high-end or more powerful portable gear, iFi's DSD Diablo, or Chord's Hugo 2, or the FIO M17, especially if you use the desktop mode, or at least something like one of the 400 and above amps, Jotunheim and above, or one of the, again, like the Chinese amps or what I call the THD meme amps behind me. They will drive them very well. But for example, if I plug, say, an A90D into the TT2 behind me, and then, there's a distinct drop in resolution listening through the A90D. So you're going to only get as good out of these as you do have with your equipment. But if you already do have a good set of equipment, say in that kind of range rather than this kind of range, and you plan to scale up in the future, the Expanse will most certainly scale with it. Now, I'm not going to get into other fine stuff like, aftermarket cables and all that. If you're interested in that, you'll already know what you want to do. If you're not, you're not. But like everything else, the Expanse will respond absolutely to the quality of any piece of equipment in your system. It'll pick up everything in terms of any harshness or hardness in your system. And I can certainly say I've very much valued all the effort I made to cut noise out of my system behind me, because the amount of detail and the listening experience made me want to push up the volume above my usual 75 to 85 dBs of listening and really rock out with the music. And I felt after doing so, I didn't feel tired or fatigued. If you know me, I don't like hyping things, but I am extremely impressed with the Expanse. I mean, to have, every pair of headphones, you have some kind of compromise. You have, you either have a design that is kind of ungainly, or you might look cool on a rack, but doesn't look cool sitting on your head. You might have something that's, sounds great, but is extremely heavy. You might have something portable, or, that there's some kind of sacrifice in the design somewhere. Every pair of headphones up to now that I've had, something has not been quite right. And I think the Expanse has come to the closest to having me being unable to find anything to fault them with. Probably maybe if you wish you could get this exact sound in a closed back pair of Stealths. Or you might think, I wish I could plug them into, a lower end portable gear and get that kind of amazing experience. So those are probably the only things you really sacrifice. I mean, they look cool, they're lightweight, they're extremely well designed, they're extremely comfortable, and if you want to take them somewhere, they fold up. That's just too good. I mean, you don't need a specialized amp to run them out of. They'll run out of regular amps, unlike electrostats and ribbons. Just really fantastic effort on Dan's part. And other than, the things I just mentioned, I really think they're just one of the probably closest to the best headphones I've ever heard. And I'm not saying that lightly. But as always, my aim is to give the most accurate impressions I can of the Expanse. And what I advise people do, if you end up buying a pair and you watch this video, please do post your impressions down in the comments so that people don't just get to see my opinion, but can see the opinions of other people and the experience of other people. Talk about the equipment, the music you used. I'm going to make a post on here.audio with what I've said in this video, plus all my music impressions, and I'll add stuff as necessary. If you do want more impressions, or you want me to try out with certain gear, do consider supporting me and becoming a patron. It's because of all my patrons that I'm able to do this. And if in exchange for your support, you can get advice, which if you're going to be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, or thousands of dollars especially, that could save you buying the wrong thing. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online.